Hello and welcome to the Welborne podcast. We invite you to join us on a journey 17 years in the making, which will eventually culminate in the creation of a unique place here in Hampshire. Driven by the passion and vision of a local landowner to create a new, thriving community just north of Fareham, where alongside 6,000 beautifully designed new homes, the region will be enhanced with accessible green spaces, shops, schools, a technology park, and much, much more. And as part of this podcast series, I'm delighted to spend time with some of the talented individuals behind bringing this vision into reality as visionaries, creatives, and architects who have combined for this truly unique, one-of-a-kind development. And I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Nicola French and Jeff Picksley, who are providing ecological consultancy across the Welborne project. First, guys, it's great to have you here in the studio. Thank you for joining us.
No, Hello. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And as part of this podcast, what we want to do is meet some of the individuals behind the project as a whole. And what's great to hear is many of the team members have worked previously with one another. I spoke to John Beresford, and I know, Nicola, you know him well, but tell us a little bit about your journey into ecology within construction, or perhaps it even begun with environmentalism before that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very, very fortunate as a child, sort of grown up very rurally and sort of the countryside, green open spaces, and actually just the natural world has always been a very important part of who I am, and just very aware that I need it for my own well-being, if you like, and that is something that's grown over time, and I think it's something that's consolidated, and I think my awareness, self-awareness, I guess, has grown to that realisation too. So going through childhood and education, my kind of formal education was one of biological sciences at university, and from there, the obvious best fit of all the options within that sort of degree course was the ecological one, just simply because it sort of was so reminiscent of where I'd come from, if you like. And I kind of fell into ecological consultancy from there, really, where I started working for a company which is very small and grew with that company in the short term, and then moved to a planning consultancy with sort of lots of different disciplines down on the south coast, which was where I met Jeff, who was also working there, and that's where we established a working relationship I don't like to
give it away to the audience. Just a few years ago.
It was a few years back now, yes. And Jeff's been a very good and important colleague working with me ever since, yes. So and that's how I began.
You mentioned there about notifying and understanding for yourself how important nature was for you. And I guess, Jeff, really, we're all on a journey doing that, probably yourself more than others, but as a society, we're understanding this more and more. What about yourself, your passions within this realm?
Well, I was always interested from very young age in sort of natural environment, and I used to work for the RSPB, and then went to university, and really quite by accident ended up down here in the New Forest. We used to come down on family holidays when I was very small, and I always wanted to be one of the New Forest rangers who worked for the Forestry Commission. And as I graduated, there was an opportunity to apply for a seasonal ranger post down in the New Forest. So I did that. I was successful. I came down on what was originally a 7-week contract, and I'm still down here 25 years
So it went well.
Yeah, I never went home.
Yes, and then from there, of course, I left the planning consultancy we were both involved in for family reasons, and from off the back of that, and actually with the encouragement of John, set up Holbury Consultancy, and the rest really is history. That was nearly 10 years ago now, and it's been such a phenomenal thing to have done, just in terms of my own autonomy, sort of being able to say yes to what I want to say yes to and no to what I don't want to do. And Jeff's been a very important part of that journey too.
Nothing better than being your own boss and the commander of your own time, right?
Yes, too right.
So Nicola, as the founder of Holbury Consultancy Services, tell us, how did you originally come on board with the project here at Welborne?
It was, I remember the phone call, an initial phone call, looking for support, one of John's colleagues looking for support in pulling the planning application together for the scheme back. I think it would probably been in 2016 now. At that time, it was the planning application was substantially formed, but there was a little bit of troubleshooting needed, particularly in relation to the habitats regulations, which was kind of my baby, if you like. It's one of my key specialisms. So I got involved in that way right at the very beginning. But as time went on, the project evolved, the scheme grew, and it became very clear that this was such a big, significant strategic scheme. It was one of a couple of other projects that I've been involved in, and I knew that to do a good job, it needed more than one brain on the case, which is where I asked Jeff if he would sort of join with me to sort of provide the sort of support and the thinking and just, that kind of teamwork that we need to do a good job, really. Yeah.
And Jeff, when this phone call came for support on the Welborne project, what were your first initial reactions to it? Was it something you were like, I really want to be involved in that? And I know you mentioned you're a local resident as well, so it must have been something close to your heart.
Yeah, and it's an area I'm really familiar with because I've worked just down the road on another large development, and also currently working on one slightly further east as well. So very familiar with zooming up and down the M27 to look at various areas. And as Nicola said, it was a habitats regulations, sort of how it all kicked off. And that particular area of wildlife legislation has always been of interest to me, and the way you're looking at sort of off-site issues as well as on-site issues. And it was just a sort of small, what we thought was going to be probably a small task originally, and it's just snowballed and snowballed.
Yes.
But in a very nice way.
But of course, it's amongst all of our priorities now, isn't it? The environmental impact on anything, any man-made project that we happen to look at planning and producing as a society. Where do you even start from your perspective, though? As the ecology of a site, where do you begin?
Yeah, well, understanding it. That's understanding what's there. And the one thing we all learn as ecologists at a very early point is you can never take anything for granted. You just don't know until you look. And so one of the most important things in any project like this is undertaking the survey work to establish what species and habitats you have on site. That's the number one job, what we call baselining. And that's undertaken by a team of ecologists, because it's rare that you'll find an ecologist who can do all types of survey. So a team of ecologists will have a sort of a suite of specialists within them, and they will all have their own little niche thing that they want to be involved with and are good at, whether that's dormouse survey or it might be badger survey or whatever. It could be anything. And it's pulling together that survey information in the first instance that gives you the ecological context for the site and the picture as to what's there on the site. Yeah.
And in the planning stage, how much weight do you actually have then with your findings?
There's quite a considerable weight attached to it. So there's normally at least 3 or 4 planning policies that will sort of identify the need to protect certain habitats, such as ancient woodland or rare and unusual grasslands. That might be at a national level or even at a local level. And then there's protected species as well. Nick's already mentioned sort of dormice, bats, badgers, great crested newts. And then sort of beneath that, there's a second tier of species that might not receive sort of protection through legislation necessarily, but would still be important at a local level. So again, they need consideration in the planning process as well.
And just to clarify, we're not talking just wildlife as well. Would it also be plant species and the trees that are of the area?
Yeah, so you've got your all those different species that we talked about depend on their habitat, which is the sort of the complex of natural organisms that work together to provide their home, basically. So it's understanding that totality, yeah.
I guess some people will be watching now and they'll want some answers. I mean, what did you find here in this region just north of Fareham?
Well, there's found a lot of different bat species, which is not particularly unusual for Hampshire per se. Generally, the further south you are in England, the more bats you pick up.
I guess that's something people wouldn't even acknowledge because they're nocturnal creatures, right? So they only come out at night. So people aren't even thinking about bats to a certain extent.
Yeah, and there was a lot of quite detailed studies done for this application, including some radio tracking of bats to find out how they were using the site. And that informs design in terms of are there key vegetation corridors, for example, that the bats are using to get maybe from roost sites to feeding areas and back again. And if they are, then obviously that needs to be considered in terms of the design evolution for the site, whether that's retaining them or lighting them sensitively as the development sort of progresses. We've done great crested newt surveys. There's a lot of rooting around in ponds. And again, that's a survey where there's quite a strong nocturnal element because they're most active at night. So there's people out with torches and trapping. Breeding birds, badgers, dormice, and then sort of vegetation surveys as well.
But there's quite an important point to make here, because when you've got a scheme the size of Welborne, which is hundreds of hectares big, if planning's doing its job properly, then you would hope there isn't much ecological interest here, because you really want to be putting development where you're not going to have a big ecological impact. And so actually this scheme, although there is a lot here, it tends to be around the edges in the sort of hedgerows, the woodlands. The actual core site of Welborne was intensively farmed arable land, which will have had lots of inputs over the years, and actually from an ecological perspective is relatively sterile. And that's good news actually from us, because what we don't want to be doing is building on important habitats or impacting species where we can't mitigate the damage. So the fact that Welborne has come forward on intensively farmed arable land is good news in that perspective, from that perspective. And it actually provides us with an opportunity, because in terms of designing the scheme and bringing the scheme forward, we can actually put back onto what historically has been quite sterile land in sort of recent history. We can start building in habitats and making it much more interesting and much more diverse from an ecological perspective. So that's a real good news story that's perhaps overlooked quite often, actually.
So just looking at your reports and your findings that you make, is it considered, I don't know if you establish bats and did you say moles and...
dormice.
Not dormice. And so these elements of wildlife that are in the region, is it a case of just rehoming them and moving them, or do you want to make sure that the ecosystem there is still working how it once did and you want to maintain that?
I think it's important that, you're looking, there's a sort of hierarchy of mitigation in terms of you want to, if you can protect things in situ, that's obviously the sort of best outcome. And so they're there for a reason, and they've chosen that area, and, whatever we interpret the landscape as, they're much better at it in terms of selecting the areas that they find favourable. And then if you do need to move animals around, it's about creating the right environment for them to thrive in once they've been moved. And then, as Nicola said, there's an opportunity there as well to provide new habitats and provide linkages and additional areas for animals to be able to move around within the site, and also create links through to the wider countryside. And as it's sort of, particularly in the south of England, as it gets more developed, those linkages through sites and across sites are becoming increasingly important to stop populations becoming fragmented.
I guess there also has to be research and analysis as well about if you do remove a particular species, what could happen to the ecosystem, because I know there's been huge attention to detail on the plant life, etc. But if you are to remove one or it doesn't thrive because of the project, then it could have other implications.
Oh, yeah. And there's a lot of guidelines and guidance, there's industry standards around that. So I think there's quite a good understanding about how you would go about moving populations of reptiles, for instance, and we're needing to do that particularly down in relation to the motorway junction.
So there's not going to be any crocodiles in these bodies of water, is there?
I promise you, there's not a single crocodile being found on Welborne, not a single one.
Okay.
So you're safe on that score.
Great stuff. So you were saying, just give us an example. So particular reptiles, is this as an introduction to the site, or is this something that already exists there?
So there's reptiles at the moment. There are some common reptile species that exist around the sort of edges of those big arable fields in the sort of field margin, if you like, in the sort of hedgerows. If there's a need to remove those margins because development is coming forward, then it's imperative that effectively those reptiles are moved out of the way. It may be as simple as just what we call habitat manipulation. So we sort of push them out to sort of adjacent habitat. We can just move them through just by slowly sort of rolling back the development and just pushing them in a direction where they can go to. But if there is nowhere for them to go, and that does happen on a scheme like this, then there is a whole strategy that is devised with the local planning authority's approval, which identifies receptor sites. And those are sites that are prepared and enhanced to make sure they provide optimum habitat for the support of reptiles, and then those reptiles, individual animals, are physically picked up and moved to their new habitat. And so there'll be a team of ecologists working on site with the construction gangs, effectively, to make sure that no reptiles are harmed during that process, and to make sure that everything is caught and captured and moved to safety.
So would that be with species that are natural to the habitat, or you may try introducing ones that haven't been found here before?
No.
Okay.
Only those species that are currently here on site. So, and there'll be species like slow worm. There's a few common lizards around, occasionally grass snake, that sort of type of reptile species, yeah.
It's wonderful. The answers that you're giving here, it leads into just this incredible consideration to detail of the Welborne project. And off camera, we were actually discussing as well something that didn't even come into my mind, thinking about you're building this new community, 6,000 homes. There's going to be people coming into work in the community as well. So you could be talking 10,000 plus people. An element that's been considered is the impact it would have on the coastline here and people visiting that. And with that in mind, you want to create this enhanced and thriving community where perhaps not everyone is going to immediately gravitate to the coast. Tell us a little bit more about those considerations.
Well, this is really where it all comes back to my initial comment about the habitats regulations, because there's some very important coastline in the southern region, the Solent coastline, and it's important because it supports a lot of migratory birds, and they arrive on the and use all of the sort of coastal habitats for both roosting and feeding, but they are very vulnerable to disturbance, and so that the importance of those bird populations is recognised through sort of legislation, and it's imperative for a development like Welborne that there is no impact on those populations inadvertently through people bringing a big population of new big population of people into the area. It's a very natural thing for them to want to do, to go to the coast, but we can mitigate that by making sure that they have lots of opportunity on site for that sort of informal recreation that they're going to the coast for. I mean, it's not going to stop everyone, but there's also sort of contributions to help support wardening and education along the coast to sort of mitigate those impacts. But by ensuring we've got really high quality, extensive areas of sort of green, natural infrastructure within the development, then people have less of a need to travel. And so it's trying to ensure that a community like Welborne is as self-supporting and self-sustaining as it is possible for it to be. And with the likes of Dashwood, large area of woodland to the north of the site, and new semi-natural habitats that will be sort of brought, if that's not an oxymoron, but new habitats brought into the development and allowed to develop and naturalise over time, then that will provide that opportunity for people to sort of grow and evolve with the landscape effectively, and start to use it in a way that's natural for them, in the way that the new community is growing and functioning.
So that's the considered impact of the humans for the Welborne project. Something that's come into my mind completely is we don't think about domestic pets as well. So if you're going to have the impact of dogs, and a lot of people, particularly with their cats, let them out into the natural environment, how does that impact an area from an ecological perspective, Jeff?
So what you tend to find, there's actually been quite a lot of studies into the impacts of sort of domestic cats.
Yeah, not just cats. Let's shout out for the cats. We love our feline friends, but it's not just cats.
No, and also dogs and things as well in terms of what's going on. But I mean, generally you're looking at, you accept there's going to be a level of disturbance in terms of sort of recreational dog walking and things like that, and then also predation from domestic cats. But of course, a lot of populations like wild birds and things, there is inherently a high degree of mortality in the populations anyway. So examples of things like robins and things, they have quite numerous broods during the breeding season and raise a lot of young, and that is with the expectation that not all of those are going to survive. Otherwise, we'd be knee deep in robins the following year. So there is it's part of the evolutionary biology.
But then it might feel like Christmas all the time, which would be nice too.
Yes.
But this is where gardens actually provide really valuable wildlife habitat. If you think about those sort of fairly sterile arable lands out there, which are almost prairie-like really, there's very little bird life. I mean, there is some, but there's not that much. when you get a kind of complexity of gardens sort of springing up in place, then as time goes on, they will all provide a lot of garden habitat, which will be very valuable for bird populations. So yeah, there is going to be a predatory pressure. You cannot avoid that. But equally, you're providing a habitat that was not there before and which birds will colonise and grow into over time. So it's one of those opportunities as well.
So for our potential residents that could be watching this, we say, if you're going to have some domestic pets, please have a bird feeder as well.
Yeah.
And put a bell on your cat.
Bell on
yes.
the cat. I think the other thing is as well, with as Nick said, with gardens and things, what you're going to look at is a changing community in terms of the animals and birds that are around as it develops. And even within the built environment, there's going to be measures with coming along to allow sort of wildlife to access gardens and things. So there'll be access points cut for hedgehogs to move in and out of gardens to enable them to forage around in people's gardens. There'll be bird and bat boxes on the buildings as well to provide new roost sites, and things even like the drainage features. They have the potential to bring in a whole host of bird species that weren't present when this was being farmed. So I would confidently expect that within a few years you'd be seeing birds like little egrets, potentially common snipe, which are small wading birds, reed buntings, possibly some of migrants from Africa like reed warblers using those features once they become established. Water, it just acts like a magnet, and you'll be bringing in all these new species to the development, which wouldn't have found a niche within a sort of large field of wheat or oilseed rape.
Yeah, and so with a little bit of care, you can actually build habitat features into what is traditionally a sort of a very urban environment. So this is aside from all the sort of green spaces, which are perhaps quite unusual for an urban community. Just by adding those bee bricks into a building is so easily done, but it provides a very easy opportunity for colonising bee species down the line. It might be bees, it could be bird or bat boxes, whatever we put in there. And I think there is I know there is a real intent to make sure that we maximise all sort of habitat opportunities across the site within the built form in a way that I've not seen before on the development. And that's really encouraging and exciting too. And it'll be fascinating to watch how that develops over the years. And as things begin to colonise and move in, they find it. I mean, the natural world is incredibly opportunistic. And if it's there, then they will find it. It might take them 5 days, it might take them 5 months, it might take them 5 years. But in time, it'll be there. And as this site matures and grows, then the wildlife and the communities associated with it will too.
That's wonderful to hear. And with my next question, it's almost like a culmination of two, that talking about how you begin to predict how the ecology might evolve as the site develops, but then what's going to be kind of like the feedback process and the continued relationship that Holbury Consultancy Services has to ensure that it's always moving in the right direction?
That is a question. In some ways, the natural world, you can kind of point it in the right direction and then you just let it happen. And it's kind of an anathema to expect that you can direct it too much in some ways. And it's important to just step back and let it evolve in the way that it's going to evolve. You can, the natural world has a way of being, and if it finds something as it is, then it will respond appropriately. So I think in some ways it's quite important not to speculate too much or anticipate, because you never know. And particularly in our world of climate change at the moment, every year is different year on year in terms of the species that we're seeing arriving and the species that we're seeing reducing in terms of their sort of occurrence. So I'm not too worried about predicting what's going to come. I know that as long as we have a whole diversity of habitats and we're sort of we're confident that the scheme will continue to sort of deliver those, then the natural world, whatever it is, will expand to fill the gaps that we create. And in terms of monitoring, then I think there's some very natural monitoring that will do. The community groups, as they move into houses, will become their own, the project's own natural monitor, I think. And I have no doubt that the amount of green infrastructure and green space around this development will engender a lot of interest in that regard within the residents. And I think there will be their own community groups that will start sort of recording what they see and posting it on social media, and that it will become its own forum, if you like. So The sort of formal side of monitoring will be there for some species, particularly protected species, where we have to have licenses in order to do the sort of habitat work around them. And there is a formal requirement for Natural England to monitor the particular species. But for those species that aren't protected and aren't recognised in that way, then I think it will just happen. And the world that is Welborne will watch and will be excited and will be interested and will be reporting to all their neighbours.
Yeah, and hopefully we can also lean on your expertise as well across the next couple of decades, which is what this Welborne project and community is all going to be about, right? It's not about delivering the reports now and saying this is how it is and this is what we're going to do and then let it thrive. I'm hoping that it will be a continued relationship across those 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and certainly we're both involved in schemes, other big schemes where they're a little bit further on. So there are residents on site in the context of sort of ongoing development around, and the sort of community interest is significant. And the demand for backwalks or sessions out with a sort of a butterfly expert or people just really curious and interested to know what is in and around is very definitely there. So to sort of have that sort of growing interest and nurture it too, because I think once people have an interest and understand what's going on their doorstep, then that develops an ownership and a responsibility and an incredible pride actually in what's happening. And it's all part of the importance of the natural world for people's individual well-being. And I think as people tune into it, they value it more and more. And I think that's inevitably where Welborne will grow.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot across the different episodes of this, talking about words such as responsibility and pride and the stewardship that comes from the top, from Buckland Development all the way down the Welborne project. And we're hoping that it will be passed over to the residents and those that use the community as well. And it sounds like there's already some great natural plans that are going to happen. But are there any more specifics on ways that you're going to ensure that the community buys into the wildlife aspect of Welborne?
I think new houses will have welcome packs, and an important part of those welcome packs will be encouraging people to understand and see the natural resource that's available to them. We have Dashwood in the north, for instance. That's going to be available very early on for residents moving into Welborne. And what's amazing about Dashwood is we don't need to do any habitat creation. It's already there, and it's an amazing natural resource, and it's got a lovely feel and vibe to it that anyone is walking through it will be very quick to pick up. So I think as soon as we're able to sort of provide pointers to people, and there will be rangers working with the local community to make sure that Dashwood is used well and understood, there'll be that sort of educational side of things as part of the Dashwood proposals and sort of what we call SANG, which isn't very helpful, but it's called Suitable Alternative Natural Green Space. This harkens back to the kind of notion of making sure that we keep pressures back off the coast and just sort of keep them sort of contained. The SANG, which is Dashwood in the north, the Welborne Mile, this big long stretch of semi-natural habitat that will extend down the west of the site, and then Fareham Common to the south of the motorway. All of those areas will be interlinked and people will be encouraged to use them. And the educational side of that is going to be really important. And the ranger role responsible for overseeing and the sort of day-to-day management will also have a really important public interface. And it's that kind of making sure that those spaces are accessible to the new community is going to be really important. And that ranger team will have a key role in that job.
So, Nicola, Jeff, what's been a huge consideration in the Welborne project is how we make Dashwood and an ancient woodland part of the site's identity. What kind of considerations have to be put into place when you bring so many people into the area?
That's a really good question. You're right. A large part, not all, but a large part of Dashwood is ancient woodland, which brings a huge responsibility, actually, because ancient woodland is a very special ecological resource. And it's important that when we're bringing a lot of development in close proximity to that woodland, that we don't allow public pressure and access to that woodland to spoil its very, very special ecological interest. So Dashwood is a key part of the green infrastructure available to residents across the site. And it will be important to make sure that when people walk through it, they avoid particularly sensitive areas. So originally we did a lot of very detailed survey work to understand exactly where the critical points were, if you like. and made sure that the path network that has been designed into the woodland avoids that in all places. So that's going to be a very important part of ensuring that sort of ecological complexity is maintained and conserved. It will also come back to sort of the management of that public pressure once people start to use the site, making sure that paths are properly stuck to, there isn't kind of divergence away from the paths to the sort of the wider woodland. So that's been a really important part. Woodland management too, the conservation management. Do you want to mention something about that, Jeff?
Yeah, so we've worked with the Southwark Estate who currently manage the woodland. So we're looking there at long-term silvicultural practices, some of it in response to situations that have developed well. Welborne's been evolving in terms of ash dieback and things. So maybe 10 years ago, we'd have gone, okay, we're fine. We have a woodland that contains lots of ash. Now we've got to look at the fact that once that dies back, how's that going to be replaced? What trees are going to be planted now that are going to form the canopy in 50 or 60 years' time? There's also looking at some sort of specific measures for managing the habitat to enhance its quality for species like dormice. So we'd be looking there to maybe coppice some areas of woodland, which is cutting down to ground level and then allowing the particularly hazel to regrow, and that will form a nice sort of dense cover in the sort of middle layer of the woodland that will provide a habitat for dormice. There'll be, as Nick mentioned, there'll be monitoring of the flora in particular to look to see how that's responding as visitors start to use the woodland, and whether we then need to take any measures to sort of protect particularly sensitive areas. There's some quite scarce plants that have fairly limited range in Hampshire that are present within Dashwood, and although the paths are routed to keep people away from those areas, of course we'll want to ensure that is how the woodland is used over time.
Can I also ask, in my basic understanding of it as well, that trees communicate underground, right, and share
do,
nutrients,
yeah.
etc. How does the soil disturbance even play into all of this?
Well, I mean, that's a key thing about ancient woodland, is the fact that you do have these sites with a long history of undisturbed soils and all the fungi and flora and microbes and things that go with that. So in terms of the path layout, if the surfaced areas going into the woodland, there will be a no-dig solution to that. So it'll be very minimal disturbance on the soils. And also, as Nick said, it'll be monitoring use and trying to ensure that people aren't widening paths and things. So we do have a facility agreed with the council that if we need to surface areas because they are in little wet hollows or whatever, and then people are starting to avoid them, we can put down some surfacing and keep people where we want them rather than using their own. And there's been a good example quite recently where there was a informal bike track had been created within the woodland that was obviously impacting quite significantly on a quite sensitive area, and the estate stepped in there and dismantled it all and have restored all the woodland. And actually I went and looked at it in the spring, and you can already see there that the bluebells are starting to come back in and things. So the estate are still taking a very active role in managing the woodland in this interim period and looking after it.
So just looking at your roles then, do you consider it more that you have to maintain the ecology, or do you see it more as you want to set people's mind at ease that the ecology will be maintained? Like, where does the balance sit in there for you guys?
I think the balance is that I think there's often a perception with development is that people go in and do what they want once you have planning permission and there are no restrictions, and that is not the case at all. And in fact, there are restrictions down to a very granular level in terms of working in proximity to, say, badger sets, for example, or the timing of vegetation removal, or, as Nick's already touched on, moving reptiles to avoid direct harm to them. So there is an element of sort of maintenance, but there is also much more thought goes into that, and you're trying to create habitats not only to accommodate what was on site, but also to accommodate what will be on site.
And there's often a misunderstanding too that wildlife and habitats need to be left alone. A lot of the interest and diversity of habitat types comes from active conservation management, and developing that kind of understanding is really important. It will be really important for the people of Welborne. So if they see a tree cut down, then they need to understand that will, in the context of Dashwood, that's been done for a reason that will probably be ecological. It might be health and safety, but it'll be ecology that will be driving it. And conservation within the context of Dashwood needs active management. So it's sort of balancing that expectation, that understanding, and knowing that some of our most ecologically complex and rich habitats are derived from sort of man-made intervention over time. So what Welborne offers is a real opportunity for the kind of concept of legacy to develop into the future, that kind of conservation management to be secured not only for Dashwood but for also the developing habitats of the Welborne Mile and Ferrum Common. And I think it just all channels and feeds into that sort of overarching idea that Welborne is going to be something a little bit different. It certainly will be from the ecological perspective, because there is a long-term vision for it that will be seen through and delivered in a way that just isn't on other more traditional developments. Yeah.
Well, guys, I'm sure I speak for everyone involved with the Welborne project that it's fantastic to have your expertise on board and help us maintain our responsibilities to the wider ecosystem that we exist in. Just for yourself, both as local residents, as Welborne begins to evolve and develop in the region where you live, what are you hoping that its overall ecological legacy, I guess, and impact can be as it progresses in the next 20 to 30 years? How much can it really stand out as a beacon?
I think in terms of the scale of habitats it's going to deliver, that's going to be really exciting to watch that develop over time, because we sit here today, we've got a plan in our mind how it's going to evolve. Nature's going to take that plan and probably improve it, and we're going to have all sorts of surprises and things on the journey, both sort of during the bits where we're sort of, we've identified green space, and then things will pop up elsewhere on the site that will have to sort of either surprise us or accommodate and things. And that's going to be a really sort of exciting part. And of course, it's going to be an ever-changing palette in terms of, we're starting now. You can walk out around the site and you can see some of the planting that's gone in at a very early stage to start mitigating the impacts. In 10 years' time, we're going to be looking at that thinking that's maturing nicely, and the next stage is going to be coming on. So by the time you're coming to the end of 25 years, I mean, some of the trees that were planted 2 years ago are going to have some real sort of stature to them and start to look really impressive.
We might all be sitting in the retirement home that exists within Welborne by that point.
Yes, but I think the other thing too is it goes back to the point that it's at the moment it's a relatively ecologically sterile site if you take it as a whole, and what Welborne will bring is a much more ecologically diverse piece of the jigsaw across the southern region. It really genuinely will bring a lot of habitats into play that just are not there, and will provide genuine opportunities for wildlife, which is really exciting and a really important legacy for the whole development.
And just from you then to end, Nicola, as you're a part of this project in your local region, how does it feel when we talk about potentially how it's going to look in the future?
Oh, incredible pride, and actually quite inspired by the whole thing, and to be part of the journey and just a tiny, tiny jigsaw piece in the whole. It's very significant, and it's just been a great privilege to be part of and involved in a project like Welborne. Yeah.
Well, Nicola, Jeff, it's been a pleasure to catch up with you as part of the Welborne podcast, and it's fantastic to hear the ecological considerations that have been made as part of bringing this project to life. As we said, there's so much that's going to be involved on the site from a human perspective, but also we want a thriving wildlife and ecology there as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for those of you watching, don't forget you can stay up to date with all things Welborne by heading over to the website at www.welborne.co.uk, and there'll be regular updates as well across the socials on Facebook, LinkedIn and Instagram. Just follow Welborne UK, and we'll see you soon.